WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. We are back from the Super Bowl. We are back in the cockpit. We are back fighting ice and rain and snow and baseball thoughts, and Luke Jones joins me now. Of course, Luke, during a little bit of our downtime, and I know we could have run to the phone lines and talked about Frank Robinson and his passing toward the end of the week, and instead I sort of gave it the weekend. There was a lot of writing about Frank Robinson, right? Like, I mean, from Thomas Boswell, and I guess a lot of folks sort of had the obituary in the can, had a story to tell. Many of the friends that I have on the show, and I'm going to chase many of them down, Tom Lavero, many other people, John Eisenberg, people who dealt with Frank. I dealt with Frank for 30 years. My dealings with Frank weren't all that particularly good, so I don't have all these warm, fuzzy memories of Frank other than a baseball game in '92. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, the story I told Torrey Smith 2 weeks ago in Atlanta with you, that's a funny, warm memory I have of Frank Robinson. All of my Frank Robinson stories really are my dad's, right? And probably similar to your dad and my dad were of different eras. But most of the Frank Robinson stories when you're 50 years old are for people 60, 65 or older at this point, and what he did on a baseball field in the late 60s, and how an uppity player from Cincinnati and an uppity Venezuelan from the south side of Chicago got dealt into the Orioles to mix with Brooks Robinson, and here comes Jim Palmer and all of these stars that align to really make a generation love the Orioles. I mean, if there's no Frank Robinson, there's no Oriole legend as we know it today.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to think about it in terms of what would have happened had they never traded, or perhaps the Cincinnati Reds wouldn't have foolishly considered him to be an old 30. I mean, it's still incredible when you go back and look at his numbers in 1965. I don't know where this came from. I mean, maybe it was a couple years before that, but you know, he hit 33 home runs in 1965. He had a 925 OPS. There's nothing that said that this guy was close to being done. But
I think you have to understand racial tensions in America in 1965. Sure. It was never portrayed that way to me by my father, who had more in common with Archie Bunker and Donald Trump than I do. But it was never portrayed to me that way. I think those are things you learn later in life as to why Frank Robinson maybe doesn't like you or perceives you wrong, or how he was treated on buses in the 1940s and 50s trying to make his way in the world, and what he became as a man and what he represented for Major League Baseball, what he represented for these cities. But there is a dark, ugly secret as to why he ever wound up here, and it had very, very little to do with how he performed as a baseball player.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd say is if you look at where he was in 60, 61, 62, and he was NL MVP in 1961, of course, his numbers did dip, but they were still really, 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 really good. I mean, there was nothing about it. You know, this wasn't a Chris Davis-like decline or anything like that. But I think for me, being 35 years old, Frank Robinson was done playing long before I was born. My memory of him is as a manager.
He's sort of the Casey Stengel to your childhood Mets or something,
and I think this is what's interesting, and at some point in time, I'll write about this, but I think for any Orioles fan, say my age to about 40, who doesn't really have any memory, I mean, I have no memory of the 83 World Series. I was 2 weeks old. But anyone who was 5 years old at that point, 5, 6 years old, doesn't really have much of a memory of that, and kind of trickling down and kind of grew up in the late 80s and early 90s in the way that I did. Even though I didn't live the Orioles' glory years, everyone was around, though, when you think about it. I mean, Earl Weaver, okay, he was done managing, but, you know, he's still, it's not as though he was, you know, estranged from the team. Brooks Robinson and Jim Palmer were broadcasters at that point. Frank was managing.
Oh, man, this is part of the brand, though, right? Keeping the band together. Yeah, and then Angelos took over, and literally over the last quarter of a century, Brooks hasn't been around, Eddie hasn't been around, Frank's now dead, he wasn't around, Earl Weaver really wasn't around much. I mean, Palmer, right, Flanagan, and then there's the incredible tragedy. We're not allowed to talk about that, though, Luke. That never happened. The Flanagan thing, not allowed to talk about that. But, I mean, these are the dark corners of the Oriole history. And now that Peter Angelos will never be spoken for again, we rip the Band-Aid off of all of this and talk about what used to be, not what is. And look, you and I will spend the better part of this week and next week and really getting up on the opening day talking about baseball and why Manny Machado doesn't have a gig and why Bryce Harper doesn't have a gig and how I had to explain to my wife yet again that Adam Jones really isn't an Oriole and probably isn't coming back again, and how you have to explain that to little Johnny if Johnny loves the Orioles too. And he's 12 years old, the way my dad had to explain Reggie Jackson to me in 1977, right? I was 9 then, by the way. So, part of this for me, Luke, is one of the reasons I'm so interested in all of this, and as are you, is you really do grow up into it. And you sort of have to understand the politics and the money and the team and the owner and as well as OPS and nerd speak and analytics. But baseball has some complexities to it, and they've always traded off of the history, right? And it was handed to you, and it was handed to me, and all of it was handed to all of us. If we want to go back to the genesis of all of it, it really is Frank Robinson. So this is really a weird period because you really do examine all of it. That if Frank means anything to you, it does go back into the 60s, and it does probably include your father or your grandfather, if you're anybody, right?
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, we've all accepted either Brooks Robinson or Cal Ripken as the greatest Oriole, and so much of that is just generational as far as, did you grow up watching Brooks? Did you grow up watching Cal? But
I got into a fight with last week on Jacksonville radio about Cal Ripken being Mr. Oriole. I'm like, dude, Cal Ripken would tell you it's Brooks Robinson.
Right.
But we have these arguments, and then Frank dies, and we're like, whoa, we have all these other things, and you're like, my dad always told me if there was no Frank, there was no 66 Orioles, right?
Right. And what I would say is it's fine to still consider Brooks Robinson or Cal. Like, again, it's I don't know if it's Coke or Pepsi, but it's not something far off from that. But to me, there's no questioning that Frank Robinson is the greatest player to have ever played for the Orioles. When you look at his career, I mean, everything about it. I mean, from an analytics standpoint, from the standpoint that he was fourth in the all-time home run list before the steroid era ever came to fruition. I mean, everything about this individual, he was just the greatest of the great baseball players.
I'd still take Palmer, but, don't tell him that.
Well, but I'm just saying Frank Robinson compared to Jim Palmer, just the entire body of work. There's no it's Frank. I mean, Frank is the greatest baseball player to have ever played for the Orioles, and in any kind of meaningful fashion. And his 6 years as a player with the Orioles were just incredible. And then you look at the contributions that he continued to make as a coach, manager, assistant general manager in the 90s. I mean, my favorite story, my personal Frank Robinson story, is at 1994 Fan Fest. I was with my father. At that point, the Fan Fest was being held, I guess, in the club level. And
so you're 10. You're 10, right?
Yeah.
They're about to go on strike. They're selling out the whole season the week before Christmas, right? Like 94. So that's Sabo, Fernandez, right? Not Lee Smith yet, though, right?
No, I'll tell you what it was. So we encountered Frank Robinson. I want to say it might have been down in the basement, and they were doing tours of the clubhouse, I believe. And I think we had just done that. I mean, my goodness, this was 25 years ago.
Little 10-year-old Luke with his dad coming in. Where did you live at this point? Were you in Pennsylvania already?
We were in Pennsylvania, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but we would go to Fan Fest every year, and I recall we kind of saw Frank Robinson down a hallway or something like that.
Hair's just getting a little silver tippy right about then,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, and my dad had kind of said, well, we can approach him, but I know sometimes he can be hit or miss with fans, and many fans have told that story over the last few days. Some people have had great experiences, some people had not so good experiences. He couldn't have been nicer. I asked him for an autograph. He was more than happy to sign. You could kind of tell he was in a little bit of a rush, though, like in a very polite way. Well, it turned out he didn't have a pen.
But by the way, Luke, I saw him, I don't know, 1,000 times in my life. He was always moving. That was part of his, that's part of the way he was always moving because someone was always chasing him.
But I will say this.
You just said it. He was the greatest baseball player in a baseball town in several cities on two coasts, and was always around the ballpark. He lived his whole life in the circus of baseball, so he was always, pursued. He was famous, but I mean, I'm glad you had a wonderful 10-year-old experience with him. It beats the alternative for sure.
Yeah. So despite not having a pen, my biggest takeaway was he was in a hurry, but there was good reason for him to be in a hurry. And he asked us, are you guys going to be hanging around for a little while still? And we said, yeah, I mean, we're here for the duration. I think it was going to probably last a couple more hours. It's probably mid-afternoon at this point. And he said, well, might want to stick around. We're going to have an announcement coming soon. Well, lo and behold, the Orioles announced at FanFest, and I believe...
Did you put it on Twitter right away when he told you?
I was just going to say, this is kind of this is a scoop as a 10-year-old Cub reporter, I suppose. But the Orioles were minutes away from announcing that they had signed Lee Smith. And they had the press conference there, and fans could even attend it. And it was kind of a big FanFest announcement, and Frank Robinson tipped us off that it was going down. I don't recall him saying the player, but he said, we're signing somebody, and I think you guys are going to like it. And hey, Lee Smith, all-time saves leader when he finished his career, so pretty cool. And like
Lee
said,
Smith
even though
was
I didn't
napping
have a pen,
right then, right? Probably right before the press conference. That was
yeah. So I mean, even though I didn't have a pen to get that autograph, I had a pretty cool experience, and I just think again with Frank Robinson, I didn't have any specific moments covering him as a member of the media. I mean, I started covering the Orioles in 2010. He was already done with Washington at that point. But I think what resonated with me, beyond the fact that he was a great player and he was a pioneer and first African-American manager, I mean, we all know that. But what always resonated with me growing up, what kind of alludes to what you mentioned, so many different teammates, whether it was Brooks or Jim Palmer or Andy Etchebarren, whoever, they all said that Frank taught them how to win. And you go back and look at the Orioles, as much as we kind of think that they suddenly just became this great team. They had some really good seasons in the first half of the 60s, but he got them over the hump. They were a good team. They became a great team overnight.
But those were the years where good teams weren't rewarded.
Oh, sure.
You couldn't be the 5 seed and stumble in and, pitch your way into the ALCS or, bullpen. I mean, it's a different game. I mean,
sure.
And I think all of us who remember that game look at this game and say this is a different game, whether we recognize it for what it is. But, yeah, and how one player can make a difference, right? Like, and having the Bryce Harpers and the Manny Machados out there, and having the Padres and the White Sox, all feign this interest and throw checks to say we need that kind of player here. And look, my dad would brought me up with that in the 70s when a Reggie Jackson came here, or when a Don Baylor and a Bobby Grich and all those guys left here in the 70s to say, you have to have a great player. You have to have great players. And Frank Robinson was passed around like a hot potato during the course of his career because he was a difficult personality, because he was the guy you didn't want to play against. And sometimes, I guess in the clubhouse, court and, all kangaroo court and all the stuff that he did there, that, being a leader was not always appreciated by ownership or the man upstairs, or when the player became more powerful than the manager or the general manager or anybody else in town, quite frankly, when the player was that good. And LeBron James would still be a modern version of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can find these examples throughout the history of professional sports. I mean, go back and look at Babe Ruth in Boston. I mean, that you're always going to find owners and organizations that don't either they're wrong in valuing someone, or they just underestimate it, or in some cases they overestimate it. Chris Davis, a great example on how you can value a player way too much. But I just think of what Frank did on so many different levels, and how about the fact that, and this is where it's unique for me, this is an individual who has a statue in, 3 different cities, Cincinnati, Baltimore, and Cleveland, being the manager there, first African-American manager. It's difficult to think of too many individuals across professional sports, and too many professional athletes who have been so revered to the point where they have been kind of immortalized, if you want to, not to place too much emphasis on a statue. But
it's interesting about the statue thing, though. Brooks has two across the street, right? I'm thinking Unitas has one in Louisville. You know, Brooks, I'm sure Brooks has one in Little Rock. I know he has one in York, Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, I can think of three for Brooks. I mean, but you know, I don't. You're right. Like, what do statues mean? But it is important to note in his case how symbolic he is in many ways of baseball in so many different places, you know?
He really is, and that's what's so amazing about his legacy. I mean, I don't know if anyone would ever say he was a great manager. Certainly his record wasn't all that impressive, but you also look at most of the teams that he managed, and very few of those had expectations, remembering things, and that team was just incredible. And
well, those are all the guys who've spoken out about. I mean, all those guys are alive, right? I mean, Kurt Schilling was speaking out about Frank Robinson this week. You know, the people that were associated with that team, you know, the trajectory of Brady Anderson's life and Steve Finley and, you know, all these names of human beings that were the Malackis and the Harnishes and Dave Johnson and all these people that were around it, and all the people like, you know, Marty Conway, who I'm going to have on at some point, and the Janet Marie Smiths who were working for the Orioles at that point and were impressionable young people, right? You know, all of these people now, by and large, are in their 50s, 60s, some cases 70s, speaking out about Frank Robinson and what he meant to their lives. But, I mean, Frank had several lives in Oriole baseball, and we haven't gotten to the one that didn't get along with Peter Angelos, right? But, you know, when I think about Frank as a manager, though, he had a really good San Francisco Giants team, Luke, and you know, look, I mean, you only get so many in that era. You don't have that many good teams. I mean, even the Yankees weren't good every year. The Red Sox were never good, right? It was an up and down proposition, which is how the Kansas Cities and the Milwaukees and the Baltimores were born, because there really was sort of a parity to some degree that existed that made it more realistic than it is, let's say, here in Baltimore right now as we go to spring training with absolutely, you know, no chance or hope of winning, right? So, or no thought of winning. Hey, I'll say this about Frank Robinson, though, and this is a fascinating thing that has gone on a lot of my life, right? How difficult it is to be a player that great. And you mentioned, you know, and manage and have those level of expectations. That would Tom Brady be a great NFL head coach? Maybe not. You know, was Ted Williams a great man? You know, Michael Jordan as a head coach. There are very few examples of great players and great coaches. And you look at the Belichicks and the Shulas and the people that were great coaches, they weren't great players. Frank Robinson would sit in the middle of that because he had so many opportunities to manage in various points over different generations. Even I forget that he ever managed the Nationals, right? And did a pretty good job, too, at the end of taking the remnants of the Expos at that point and managing them. But Frank Robinson would be that guy that someone like my father would say, see, there's a reason a great player can't be a great manager. Look at Frank. He was never a great manager. Well, that's a pretty high standard. He did a pretty good job with the '89 Orioles, as you're about to point out, right?
Sure. And I like that you brought up the point about we think of so many different great players. And, you know, what's so interesting about this over time, you think back to, the concept of a player manager, which Frank Robinson was in Cleveland. I mean, even at that point in the 70s, that was such a rare thing at that point. You kind of think back, you know, Bill Russell and the Celtics, and, you know, you saw it in basketball a little bit, but the idea of that happening today, I mean, maybe LeBron James at some point will become player coach of the Lakers. I mean, the way he tries to pull the strings.
Yeah, maybe like Ekman to become the referee.
Yeah. But I think it really is a tribute to him that he had the success that he had as a manager in comparison to other great players who have had opportunities to manage. And look, let's be really honest about this. So much of being a successful manager or a successful head coach in the NBA, NFL, NHL, it really does come down to the environment in which you walk into. I mean, it's. You can't win without great players. You can't win without good ownership and the support of a front office. And whether you're a coach who has personnel say, there are so many different variables at work. I mean, we look at, we've talked so much about John Harbaugh, who just got an extension, Super Bowl winning coach, has been to the playoffs 7 times in 11 years. And if, let's say he had gotten a job, I don't know, in Miami that year, or he became the Cowboys coach a couple years later, or something like that. Let's say he would have gotten an opportunity elsewhere, which isn't a guarantee considering he was a special teams coordinator. There's no saying that he would have been overly successful elsewhere, and that's not a knock on him as much as it's a compliment to the organization and the infrastructure. And I just think there are so many different variables at work, especially when you're talking about a coach. It's one thing when you're a player who can control certain variables. A great hitter can go up to the plate, and even though his team stinks, he can put up great numbers. A great pitcher, maybe his win-loss record's not going to look as good, and that's one reason why win-loss record is something that doesn't have as much clout as it used to, because we understand context and other variables. But great pitcher can go out there and perform. You can be the best manager in the world, and if you don't have the players, you don't have the horses for it, you're going to struggle. And maybe you can make a bad team mediocre. Maybe you can make a mediocre team decent. Maybe you can make a decent good. But you're not going to take bad players and Al Ripken and a couple other talented players, and then there's a bunch of guys who, they caught lightning in a bottle to the point where they got to the final weekend at Skydome in Toronto. That he made, the things that he accomplished, certainly the head of the list is being a player, and the head of the list historically is being the first black manager in the major leagues, but he accomplished so much, and that's where I think his legacy is just so interesting. Even just on a small scale here in Baltimore, you can remember him as a player, as a coach, as a manager, as assistant general manager, and it really covers a long period of time. And to think that he's remembered so fondly in some other cities here over these last few days really does speak to how much he accomplished here in baseball.
Ever tell you about the time he rung me up on a 3-2 pitch 8 inches off the plate in the low?
Well, you gotta be protecting the plate, right?
My image, and it's funny because I have the picture. I put the picture up. Schmuck was wearing like sort of this Yukon Jack sort of shirt. I don't know. It was sort of this. I don't know. It was long sleeve, but he had California Angels home stirruped polyester pants, the Rod Carew, Frank Tanana, early 80s with the blue and red stripe down the side, and it had the striped waistband, you know what I mean, that snapped in the front with the little snaps on it, the little buttons.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was up there. There was a 3-2 pitch, and, Schmuck came over the top. Schmuck was, 25 years younger, 27 years younger then. So, Schmuck was probably throwing in the 60s, low 70s or something at that point, And he grooved it in the pitch, and I still see Frank, left arm up, right arm all the way up, and he gave me the, like the heave-ho. Oh. He gave me the honk, the horn, the year.
Gave you the Durwood Merrill punch-out, right?
I'm looking at him. I'm like, Frank, I mean, you got to be kidding me. It was the first at-bat of the whole game, right? So Frank, I think, was sort of setting the tone, for where the strike zone was going to be.
Frank was telling you all that he had a 6 o'clock dinner reservation.
It took me 27 years and time on your couch to realize that he was just setting up the game. I never really thought about it like that. I thought he had it out for me and just wanted to make a fool of me. But it turned out that, I doubled the next at bat. I made a decent defensive play. I think I also threw one into the dugout, if you want me to be honest. Part of it was Phil Wood was playing first base, and he made statues look mobile. So that was going on too. So we had all of that happening, in the course of that game. And Timmy Kirkshin played in that game. Keith Mills was a hell of an athlete. I mean, Keith Mills came out. Keith Mills was all Metro when Cal Ripken was all Metro. They were like a year apart or same year. I mean, Keith Mills is a hell of a baseball player down in Brooklyn Park in his day. So there were some guys on the field. I was a decent player, but I wasn't a good player. I'm trying to think of who else played in the game that really was an exemplary player. Keith was for sure. But anyway, Chris Ely played in that game. Chris was a good athlete, lacrosse guy. Chris was. I'm going to look at the picture and see. Bruce Cunningham was in that picture. Let's see. I couldn't find Ken Rosenthal in the picture. But my memory is that he played in it. Dave Ginsburg was in that picture. Ted Patterson's in the picture. Mark Maskey's in that picture. Scout, now a scout. Last I checked, I think he was scouting for the Texas Rangers. His name is Keith Beck, Boeck, one of my LinkedIn buddies. He's in that picture. Alan Charles is in that picture. Mark Jacobson is in that picture wearing a then Washington Senators hat that is now a Washington Nationals hat. By the way, Doug Melvin is in that picture.
Okay.
That is a very young, trim Doug Melvin in a red tie on the right there, drinking some Gatorade.
It is a great photo. It really is.
So there it is. So, people couldn't tell Bill Stetka from Bruce Cunningham, if that matters. And I'm looking through the front row here now. Yeah, and by the way, Max Morgan was in that picture, the late, great Max Morgan, who once – my best Max Morgan story is this. On opening day, I once urinated in the men's media room on the second level, the broadcast level, behind Bill Clinton. I came out of the, you know where the food room is, right? Mm-hmm. The men's room's there. Yeah. I went up there in like the second or third inning to pee on opening day, and there were Secret Service men outside the men's room, 2 dudes. And they looked at me, they're like, can't go in there. I'm like, do I have to leave? No, you just can't go in there right now. And Bill Clinton comes out, and I'm on camera right now, Luke, so I'm going to stand up because I got my Bill Clinton comes out of the bathroom, and he looks down at his fly, and he adjusts it, and he fixes his belt, and he says, okay, we're good to go now. And Bill Clinton left. So he apparently on that day, as the legend has it, Bill Clinton walked onto the field at Camden Yards and walked by everybody and saw Max Morgan in the dugout and walked over, passing everyone, to say hello to Max Morgan. Huh. And everybody's like, dude, the president of the United States just like walked through here and walked right up to Max Morgan. And Bruce is like, yeah, he was the Little Rock, Arkansas sports guy.
That's pretty good.
So that's how he knew him. So, it would be kind of sort of like, I don't know.
Very good.
Someone
Very
famous
good.
coming
Yeah,
so I have some. That's my Max Morgan story. So little Max Morgan, Lord Alan Charles is in this picture. I'm trying to see if there's anybody else that I recognize or don't recognize or didn't know. There's a few faces of people I recognize, and I'm like, what was that guy's name? Was it Steve? Was it Tim? Was it Bill? John Telcos is in that picture.
Okay.
John Telcos is in that picture. Yes. So that's that. So there you have it.
He wrote for the York Daily Record, right?
He wrote absolutely, and he also had.
I remember him well.
He owned
Pennsylvania.
He owned a bagel company. He made delicious bagels that he would bring around for the media. So there you have it. That picture was in the summer of 1992 at Oriole Park at Camden. It's a bit of a period piece, right? Because the hotel's not there. You can see the Bromo Seltzer Tower, right? The old Budweiser things on the scoreboard, the Giant signs in the background, the Legg Mason sign, the Hit It Here.
A period piece, but also just the fact of having a media game for any team in this day and age. You just don't see that anymore. I mean, it was a different era, not just for the Orioles, but you don't see those types of things around pro sports anymore.
You can turn to. Now they throw Bob Costas out of the NFL. Luke Jones is here. You can find him. Baltimore Luke at WNST.net. We're going to be doing more storytelling around here, quite frankly, Luke, because I don't know if you've heard or not, the baseball team's going to suck. So we're going to try to have as much fun as we can have around here. I'm going to do a segment beginning soon where you must come down. We must do it on camera. Or maybe we sit somewhere in a restaurant. And I'm going to bring a box of old baseball crap, and I'm going to pull it out on camera, and we're going to tell stories about crap. Because my son found the greatest piece of crap that if my wife could hear me and yell and come in and find it, I would actually hold it up right now, because my wife found a piece, or my son found a piece in my mom's home that I've never seen before. It's a 1971 World Series media kit that is completely in mint condition. It's not my media kit. I think maybe like Stedman gave it to me or something. You know what I mean? Stedman at one point at the News American, when the place was going out of business, and he said, "Senor, round up my stuff and let me go through it." And I gave it to him, and he gave me a box of stuff that he didn't want. He's like, "This stuff will mean more to you. You keep it." I mean, there's like a letter George Hallis once wrote him and stuff, signed by George, all this stuff. But I don't know why it was at my mom's house, but my son found it. I now have it, and I thought, you know what? In the era of Facebook Live and YouTube Live and cool stuff, I'm going to break some of this stuff out this year. We're going to talk about it because Frank Robinson's death gives us a reason to reminisce about things that have Frank Robinson's name in the starting lineup, right?
Very good, yeah. Absolutely. It sounds good.
And it's cool because the back of it has all the old logos from the 1970s. The old Twins logo that's now on the scoreboard. You know, the old Angry Oriole Bird logo. The old Washington Senators logos on this thing because those are their last year of existence. The California Angels logo with the state of California and the halo around it that makes you think of like Nolan Ryan and Bobby Valentine. Oh, and by the way, Frank Robinson too. How about that?
Absolutely.
There's full circle. There it is. My first baseball card was the Frank Robinson 1974 California Angel where it looks like he's striking out. He's missing the ball. I think they did that on purpose because they didn't like Frank either. They didn't want him muscling up in the picture either. So those 73 and 74 pictures, there was something Mafia-related going on those baseball cards. But I'll take that up with Gary Vaynerchuk next time we talk. Baseball.